Elizabeth spent the whole night in Jane's room, keeping an eye on her. By morning, Jane was doing a little better. Nothing amazing, but not scary either. That was good enough for Elizabeth to send back a decent reply to all the questions flying in. Mr. Bingley checked in first through a maid, and later his sisters sent their own polite messengers. Even then, Elizabeth wasn't totally convinced. She figured her mom needed to see Jane with her own eyes, so she sent a note home asking Mrs. Bennet to come over and judge the situation herself. The message barely had time to cool before Mrs. Bennet showed up, dragging the two youngest girls along with her right after breakfast. Now, here's the thing. If Jane had looked seriously sick, Mrs. Bennet would have gone full panic mode. But once she saw Jane wasn't in real danger, her attitude flipped. Suddenly, she wasn't in any rush for Jane to recover. Why? Because if Jane got better, she'd have to leave Netherfield, and that place was way too good to give up so soon. So when Jane suggested going home, Mrs. Bennet shut that down fast. The doctor agreed too. No moving Jane anywhere. After sitting with Jane for a bit, Miss Bingley invited them all into the breakfast room. Bingley greeted Mrs. Bennet politely and asked if Jane was worse than expected. "Oh yes," Mrs. Bennet said dramatically, "way too sick to be moved. The doctor says absolutely not, so we'll just have to stay a little longer and rely on your kindness." "Moved?" Bingley said, shocked. "No way, that's not happening. My sister wouldn't allow it." Miss Bingley jumped in, all cool and stiff. She promised Jane would get every bit of attention while she stayed. Mrs. Bennet thanked her like she'd just saved the world. Then she launched into one of her speeches, how Jane was incredibly ill but still patient, how sweet her temper was, how her other daughters didn't compare, how amazing Netherfield was, and how she hoped Bingley wouldn't leave anytime soon. Bingley laughed and said he did everything fast. If he ever decided to leave, he'd probably be gone in 5 minutes, but for now he was staying put. Elizabeth teased him, saying that sounded exactly like him. "Oh, so you figured me out already," he joked. "Oh yeah, totally." That kicked off some playful back and forth about character, personalities, and how complicated people can be. Darcy jumped in, saying country life didn't offer much variety when it came to studying people. Mrs. Bennet did not like that. She jumped in, offended, insisting the country had just as much drama as the city. Everyone went quiet. Darcy looked at her for a second, then turned away. Mrs. Bennet took that as a win and kept talking. Elizabeth tried to save the moment by changing the subject, asking about Charlotte Lucas. Big mistake, because that just gave her mom a new topic to ramble on about. Manners, gossip, looks, and how Jane was obviously the prettiest girl around. She even brought up some random guy who once wrote poems about Jane and then ghosted. Elizabeth cut in, clearly annoyed, joking that poetry usually kills love faster than anything. Darcy said poetry is the fuel of love. Elizabeth shot back that maybe for strong love, but weak feelings don't survive a single sonnet. Darcy just smiled. Eventually, Mrs. Bennet thanked Bingley again and called for the carriage. That's when Lydia stepped up and reminded Bingley, very boldly, that he'd promised to throw a ball. He handled it smoothly, saying he was ready any time as soon as Jane recovered. Lydia was happy with that and already planning more dances in her head. The Bennets left and Elizabeth went straight back to Jane, leaving everyone else to quietly judge what they'd just witnessed. Darcy, though, refused to criticize Elizabeth, even when Miss Bingley made jokes about her fine eyes. The next day felt pretty much the same. Jane kept improving slowly. In the evening, Elizabeth joined everyone in the drawing room. Darcy was busy writing a letter. Miss Bingley sat way too close, constantly interrupting him with comments about his handwriting, his letters, and literally everything else. He barely reacted. Bingley and his brother-in-law were playing cards. Elizabeth worked on some sewing and quietly watched the awkward interaction between Darcy and Miss Bingley. She found it kind of entertaining, especially how hard she tried and how little Darcy cared. They started talking about letters. Darcy answered politely, but briefly. Miss Bingley kept fishing for attention. Bingley joked about Darcy using big, fancy words. Darcy fired back, calmly. Elizabeth jumped in with a witty comment, which Darcy responded to by calling out fake humility. That turned into a whole debate about pride, persuasion, and whether people should change their plans just because a friend asks. Bingley tried to shut it down with humor, joking about Darcy being intimidating, especially at home on a Sunday night. Darcy smiled, but Elizabeth noticed he was a little offended. To lighten the mood, Darcy suggested some music. Miss Bingley rushed to the piano. While she played, Elizabeth noticed Darcy watching her, a lot. She couldn't tell if he admired her or judged her, but either way, she didn't really care. Later, Darcy asked if she felt like dancing. Elizabeth smiled and said no, very clearly and very confidently, basically daring him to look down on her. He surprised her by saying he wouldn't. That caught her off guard. Darcy, meanwhile, was completely charmed, whether he wanted to or not. He knew he was getting dangerously close to falling for her. Miss Bingley noticed. She didn't like it at all. The next day, she tried to mess with Darcy by joking about him marrying Elizabeth and fixing her family. Darcy played along, cool and sharp as ever. When Elizabeth herself showed up, Miss Bingley awkwardly backed off. They tried to ditch Elizabeth during the walk, but Darcy stopped that fast and suggested a wider path. Elizabeth laughed, told them they looked great without her, and walked away on her own, happy, light, and hopeful that she'd be heading home in a day or two. Jane was finally well enough to leave her room. And yeah, things were definitely starting to shift.